We are on part 2 of chapter 4, and the previous section we saw that users can be assigned share permissions, and we saw that users can be assigned NTFS permissions. Now let's discuss what happens when we combine permissions. First, let's talk about combining share permissions. Share permissions are cumulative. So here's the example. If a user has permissions and a user is a member of a group, then the user will have both permissions. The permissions are additive. One does not supersede the other. So if Bob has the read permission to the accounting folder and the sales group has the change permission to the accounting folder, and Bob is a member of the sales group, then Bob will have both read and change permissions to the accounting folder. Now let's discuss NTFS permissions. NTFS permissions are also cumulative, meaning if a user has permissions and a user is a member of a group, then the user will have both permissions added up. NTFS permissions are cumulative. So if Sue has the read NTFS permissions to the payroll folder and the accounting group has the write NTFS permission to the payroll folder, and Sue is a member of the accounting group, then Sue will have both read and write NTFS permissions to the accounting folder because NTFS permissions are cumulative. Now, let's go to combining share and NTFS permissions. That works differently. With share and NTFS permissions, when you combine the two together, you get that which is most restrictive, not cumulative. When we combine share and NTFS permissions. So here's the example. Fred has the full control permission, the full control share permission to folder X. And Fred also has the read NTFS permission to folder X. When we combine share permissions and NTFS permissions, we get that which is most restrictive. So in this example, Fred would just have the read permission. Because when you combine share permissions and NTFS permissions, you get that which is most restrictive. So there are so many ways for a user to get permissions. He can be assigned share permissions or NTFS permissions. The permissions can be assigned directly to the user, or the permissions can be assigned to a group that the user is a member of, or the user can inherit permissions from higher level folders. So to figure out what somebody's effective permissions are, you go to that folder and you select the Effective Permissions tab. So given the billing folder, the question is, what are Sue's effective permissions to the billing folder? So if I right click on billing and I go to properties and I go under security, if I click on the advanced button, notice there is a tab that says effective access. So I will select a user, and the user I will select will be Sue. And the question is, what are her effective permissions? To view the effective permissions, I click on View Effective Access. And we can see that she has the read permission and the execute permission and the permission to read attributes, but she does not have full control. But wait a minute, I thought she was given full control NTFS permissions. That's true, she was. However, the share permissions she got was only the read-only permission, which she got by being a member of the Everyone group. So you can see that even though she got full control NTFS permissions, her permissions were limited by the share permission, which in this example was only read-only. When you combine share permissions and NTFS permissions, you get that which is most restrictive. NTFS users can be assigned permissions in many different ways. NTFS permissions are share permissions by being a member of a user or a group. Everyone can be assigned permissions. Permissions can be inherited, and to figure out what somebody's permissions are, you go to the individual folder and select the Effective Permissions tab. Now let's discuss shadow copy. Here's the situation. On Monday, a user creates a file. Perhaps it's a proposal to a customer. And on Tuesday, the user modifies the file. And on Wednesday, the user modifies the file. And then on Thursday, the user says he wants a copy of the file as it was on Monday. So the question is, do you, the administrator, need to perform a restore from the backup to get that file back? And the answer is not if shadow copies is configured, because shadow copies makes a backup of users' individual files. To configure shadow copy, we go to the Windows Explorer, we go to the C drive, and I right-click on the C drive, and I select Properties. And you can see that shadow copies is disabled for both the C drive and the D drive. To enable shadow copy, all I have to do is click on Enable. And you can see that shadow copies allow users to view the contents of shared folders as the contents existed at previous points of time. I've enabled shadow copy. Now, if I click on Settings, and if I look at the schedule, we can see that a backup is made of the user's files in his or her home folder every day at 7 a.m. and every day at 12 noon. The backup is stored in the user's home folder. It's just not available to the user unless the user selects the previous version tab. So we can see the schedule is shadow copies are made every day at 7 a.m. and 12 noon, and you can certainly add to that if you want. So shadow copies is enabled. So shadow copies allows the user to recover a previous version of a file. So in this example, it will allow the user to recover a file which was created on Monday. So here's the user Bob, and this is the customer proposal that he created and then he modified. So if Bob right-clicks on the customer proposal and selects Properties, there is a tab that says Previous Versions. If we click on the Previous Versions tab, we can see that this is the file that Bob was working on Monday. If I click on Restore, it brings that copy of the file back. So shadow copies allows users to retrieve previous versions of files. Now let's discuss quotas. A quota limits the amount of space that a user can use on the file server hard disk. So what we're trying to avoid is a user taking his entire DVD collection and copying it up to his home directory on the server. So we want to prevent the user from taking up all space on the disk, because if the disk is filled up, then the disk operates really, really slowly. So if I right-click on the C drive and I select Properties, we can see a tab on the upper right that says Quota. And currently disk quotas are disabled. If I click on the checkbox that says Enable Quota Management, it will simply measure who is using how much space. But if I want to prevent users from using more space than they are allocated, then I click on the checkbox that says Deny disk space to users who are exceeding the quota limit. So I will set the limitation to 10 gig. I will make it so the users have a maximum of 10 gig space on the server, and I will set the warning level to 9 gig. So now all users can use only 10 gig of space on the C drive on the server, and this applies to all users. Now if I want to give one user different quotas, notice there's a button that says quota entries. This allows me to configure the quotas for one individual user. If I click on quota entries and I want to add a quota for the individual user, I click on quota and I select new quota entry. I select find now. I select the user Bob, followed by OK and OK. And under the add new quota entry window, I select limit disk space 2. And I will make it 100 gig for the user Bob, and I will set his warning level to be 99 gig. So everybody else is limited to 10 gig, but Bob has a limit of 100 gig. So quotas can be used to limit disk usage. Quotas can be configured for all users, or quotas can be configured for individual users. Now let's look at folder quotas. A folder quota specifies the maximum size that a folder can be. Now, how is that different? In the previous example, we said no one user can use more than 10 gig of hard disk space. So the limitation is placed upon the user. But with folder quotas, we are specifying the maximum size that an individual folder can be. To configure folder quotas, we run the File Server Resource Manager, and we have to first install the File Server Resource Manager. So to install the File Server Resource Manager, we go to Server Manager, and we select Manage, and under Manage we select Add Roles and Features. We will select role-based or feature-based installation, followed by Next. We will do it on Server 1, followed by Next. And we can see that the File and Storage Services is currently installed. If I expand that by clicking on the triangle next to it, there are other sub-services that I can add as well, such as the File Server Resource Manager, which can be used for configuring quotas. I click on the checkbox on the File Server Resource Manager, I click on Next, I click on Next, I click on Install, and the File Server Resource Manager gets installed. Now let's use the File Server Resource Manager. To use the File Server Resource Manager, to create folder quotas, we go to Server Manager under Tools, and under Tools we select the File Server Resource Manager. Under Quota Management we expand that, and here we can see quotas. Currently there are no quotas configured. So I will right click on quotas and select Create Quota. The quota path will be the accounting folder. So the idea is I don't want this folder to get too filled up. Click on OK. Then I will specify how do you want to configure quota properties. I will select Define Custom Quota Properties, and I'll click on Custom Properties. And I will configure it such that the space limit, the maximum limit, will be 50 gigabytes for that individual folder, and I will just give it a brief description. I'll just call it 50 gigabyte limit. Hard quota versus soft quota. A soft quota simply monitors how much space each person is using, but it does not prevent the limit from being exceeded. If you select hard quota, then that prevents any more than 50 gig from being stored in this individual folder. And now we can see that the accounting folder on the C drive has a limit of 50 gigs. So you can configure quotas to limit storage usage per user under volume properties, or you can configure quotas per folder using the File Server Resource Manager. In summary, in this chapter we discussed the file server role, sharing, mapping a network drive, share permissions, NTFS permissions, inheritance, effective permissions, shadow copy, and quotas. Shadow copy and quotas. And this concludes Chapter 4. Thank you very much